In the sun-baked heart of Texas, a deadly mistake is about to shake the foundations of the criminal underworld. When the notorious Carson Gang targets what seems to be just another lonely ranch run by a quiet widow, they think they've found the perfect hideout. They couldn't be more wrong. Sarah Blackwood isn't your typical ranch woman. For 15 years, she was the most feared bounty hunter in the American West, bringing in the deadliest outlaws alive when even U.S. Marshals failed. They called her Shadow Rose, a ghost that moved in darkness and struck without mercy. This isn't just another tale of outlaws and revenge. This is the story of how the most dangerous train-robbing gang in Texas learned that some legends never fade. When they forced their way onto her land, they didn't realize they were walking into a trap set by the very hunter they'd spent years avoiding. What follows is the story of how one woman would dismantle the infamous Carson Gang in just 3 days, using nothing but her wits, her skills, and the reputation that made hardened killers tremble at whispers of her name. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold as Sarah Blackwood walked her fence line. Her boots left quiet impressions in the morning dew, each step precise and purposeful. At 45, she moved with a fluid grace that belied her years, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Old habits that had kept her alive through 15 years of hunting the West's most dangerous outlaws. Her ranch hands called her Miss Sarah, a quiet widow who could outwork men half her age. They didn't question why she always wore a long duster, even in the Texas heat, or why she insisted on checking the property lines herself each morning. They certainly never asked about the twin colts she kept perfectly maintained, but never seemed to wear. "Morning, Miss Sarah." Tom, her youngest ranch hand, called out from the stables. He was 17, eager, and reminded her too much of herself. At that age, before she'd learned how high the price of justice could be. "Spotted some broken fence posts out by the North Creek. Want me to ride out and fix them?" Sarah paused, studying the boy's open face. He was one of many local kids she'd given work to over the years, part of her carefully constructed image as the generous widow Blackwood. "Take Marcus with you," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Been hearing about wolves in those parts." It wasn't wolves she was worried about. 3 days ago, she'd read about the Carson Gang's latest train robbery in the newspaper. 15 passengers dead, including 2 children. The gang was getting bolder, more violent. And if she knew Jack Carson, and she did, having nearly caught him twice before hanging up her guns, they'd be looking for a quiet place to lay low. Her ranch, sitting isolated on the trade route between 2 major cities, would look mighty tempting to desperate men. The morning routine continued as usual. Sarah supervised the cattle count, checked the horses, and reviewed the ledgers in her study. To anyone watching, she was simply a capable ranch owner, going about her business. They wouldn't notice how she positioned her desk to face both windows and the door, or how the heavy bookshelf could easily slide aside to reveal her old gear. "Mail's here, Miss Sarah," Martha, her housekeeper, announced. The older woman had been with her for 8 years, ever since Sarah had settled here. She was one of the few who knew fragments of the truth, though even she didn't know everything. "There's a letter from Marshal Jenkins." Sarah took the envelope, recognizing the familiar handwriting. Tom Jenkins had been one of the few lawmen who'd worked with Shadow Rose and lived to tell about it. He'd also been the one who'd helped her disappear when she'd decided to leave that life behind. The letter was brief. "They're moving east. 3 days out. Watch your back, Rose." Sarah fed the paper into the fireplace, watching it curl and blacken. 8 years of peace, of building something honest and good, might be coming to an end. She'd chosen this land carefully, built her new life with the same precision she'd once used to track outlaws. But she'd never fooled herself into thinking she could truly escape her past. Moving to the window, she watched Tom and Marcus riding out to fix the fence. Good boys, honest boys, the kind of people she'd built this ranch to help, to give second, and chances to. The irony wasn't lost on her. Shadow Rose, once the most feared name in the territories, now playing guardian angel to troubled youth. In her study's secret compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the twin Remingtons that had made her famous, custom-made, with roses engraved on the pearl handles, a calling card that had sent more than one outlaw running at the mere sight. She hadn't touched them in 8 years, but she still cleaned them monthly. Another habit that died hard. "Will we be having guests soon?" Martha asked quietly from the doorway, her knowing eyes taking in Sarah's distant expression. "Maybe," Sarah replied, touching the window glass. "Might want to stock up on medical supplies, just in case." The sun climbed, higher, burning away the morning mist. Sarah Blackwood, respected rancher, continued her day's work. But beneath the surface, Shadow Rose was awakening, calculating angles, planning defenses, remembering old skills that had never truly faded. The Carson Gang was coming, and they were about to learn why, even after 8 years, mothers still quieted, unruly children with whispered warnings about Shadow Rose. The afternoon sun beat down on Miller's General Store as Sarah tied her horse outside. Saturday was supply day in town, another routine she'd maintained for years. It helped cultivate her image, the reliable widow who could set her watch by her habits. Inside, conversation died briefly as she entered, then resumed with practiced casualness. "Miss Sarah," Sheriff Cole nodded from his usual spot by the pot-bellied stove. He was new to the job, young and earnest, nothing like the hardened lawman she'd once worked alongside. "Heard your boys spotted wolves up north." "Nothing they can't handle," Sarah replied, selecting coffee and flour from the shelves. She noticed the wanted posters on the wall behind him. The Carson Gang featured prominently, their bounty now up to $5,000 each. The sketches barely did them justice. Mrs. Miller, arranging penny candies at the counter, couldn't contain herself. "Did you hear about the train? Those poor children." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They say Carson shot them himself just to prove a point." Sarah's hand tightened imperceptibly on a tin of tobacco. She remembered Jack Carson before he'd become infamous, a young hothead with something to prove. She'd had him in her sights once, 6 years before she'd retired. The shot had been perfect, but she'd hesitated. Sometimes mercy came back to haunt you. "Telegraph came through this morning," Sheriff Cole announced, clearly troubled. "They hit another train near Fort Worth. No casualties this time, but they got away with the payroll. Army's sending troops to patrol the rail lines." "Bit late for that," old Jim Tucker muttered from his chair by the window. At 70, he was the town's unofficial historian. "What we need is Shadow Rose back." Now, there was a real hunter. Remember when she brought in the Dawson brothers? All 3 tied up neat as Sunday packages. Sarah busied herself examining canned peaches while the locals shared their favorite Shadow Rose stories. Each tale grew taller than the last. How she could shoot the spots off a playing card at 50 paces, how she could track a man through solid rock, how outlaws would surrender at just the whisper of her name. "She's probably dead," Sheriff Cole said dismissively. "No one's heard from her in, 8 years?" "Or married with a passel of kids," Mrs. Miller suggested. "Even bounty hunters deserve happiness." A commotion outside drew their attention. 2 riders were coming in fast, trailing dust. Sarah recognized Tom and Marcus, her ranch hands. Their faces were pale, urgent. "Sheriff!" Tom called out, swinging down from his horse. "Found something up by the creek. Campsite fresh, maybe dozen men. They left in a hurry, but—" He hesitated, glancing at Sarah. "Found this." He held out a playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Sarah knew without looking it would have a bullet hole dead center. Carson's signature, a mockery of her own past calling card. Probably just drifters, Sheriff Cole said, but his hand rested on his gun belt. I'll ride out and take a look. I'll head back too, Sarah announced calmly, gathering her supplies. Boys, help me load these into the wagon. Outside, while the Sheriff prepared his horse, Tom spoke quietly. Miss Sarah, there's something else. Found your old boundary markers moved, the ones with the... He glanced around. Special markings. Sarah nodded. Years ago, she'd set up a warning system around her property. Subtle signs that only someone with her training would recognize. If they'd been disturbed, it wasn't by accident. Martha's been baking all morning, she said conversationally as she climbed into the wagon. Why don't you boys come up to the house for supper? Might need help moving some furniture, too. They understood her meaning. Every few months, she had the hands help rearrange the house. A widow's prerogative, they thought. But each new arrangement was a carefully planned defensive position. Sightlines, cover, escape routes. Old habits died hard. As she drove home, Sarah spotted dust on the horizon, riders moving fast and staying low. Not army patrols, they rode too openly, not local cowboys. They'd be heading for town on a Saturday. The Carson Gang was coming just as Jenkins had warned. They'd chosen her ranch just as she'd predicted. And now Shadow Rose had a choice to make. Maintain her peaceful life or unleash the legend she'd tried so hard to bury. The loaded Remingtons in her study whispered their own answer. Some legends never truly retired. They just waited for the right moment to ride again. Twilight crept across the ranch as Sarah opened the hidden compartment in her study. The familiar scent of gun oil and leather brought memories flooding back. Her fingers traced the rose engravings on the Remington's pearl handle, remembering the day James had given them to her. A rose with thorns, he'd said, her mentor's eyes twinkling. Just like you, girl. James Carter had been the best bounty hunter in 3 territories before a Comanche arrow took him. He'd found her at 16, a runaway seeking vengeance for her murdered family. Instead of turning her away, he'd taught her everything he knew, tracking, shooting, the patience of the hunt. Most importantly, he'd taught her to channel revenge into justice. Sarah lifted the gun belt, the weight familiar despite 8 years of disuse. Beneath it lay her old journal, its pages filled with sketches and notes on every outlaw she'd ever tracked. She opened to the entry on Jack Carson, studying the detailed observations she'd made years ago. Left-handed but shoots right. Favors his right leg. Old injury from a horse fall. Superstitious about thunderstorms. The memories came sharp and clear. Carson on his knees, her gun at his head, thunder rolling in the distance. She'd had him dead to rights, but then she'd seen his eyes. Young, terrified, reminding her too, much of herself at that age. She'd let him live, thinking he might change. 3 days later, he'd killed his first innocent. Sarah moved methodically through her preparations. Hidden caches of ammunition emerged from behind false walls. Mirrors were adjusted to cover blind spots. The heavy oak dining table, already positioned for cover, was subtly reinforced. Miss Sarah, Martha's voice carried from the hallway. The boys are here for supper. Send them to the study, Sarah called back, replacing the floorboard over her. Old gear. When Tom and Marcus entered, she was sitting at her desk, looking every bit the proper ranch owner. Close the door, she instructed. Both boys shifted nervously. No one was usually allowed in her study. What you found today wasn't an accident. Bad men are coming, and I need to know if you boys can follow instructions without asking questions. They exchanged glances, then Tom spoke up. Like how you taught us to always watch the horizon while we work, or how you made us memorize signals for danger. Sarah smiled slightly. Of course they'd noticed. She'd been training them subtly for months, preparing for this possibility. Exactly. Tomorrow, you'll take the other hands and move the herd to the south pasture. All of them. But that's 2 days' ride, Marcus protested. Precisely. Her voice carried an edge of steel they'd never heard before. You'll leave at first light. If anyone asks, I sent you because of wolf troubles. "What about you, Miss Sarah?" Tom's young face showed genuine concern. She stood, her movement suddenly different, fluid, dangerous. For a moment, Shadow Rose emerged from behind the widow's mask. "I'm going to have some visitors. Best you boys aren't here when they arrive." Understanding dawned in their eyes. They'd grown up hearing Shadow Rose stories, now watching their employer move like a predator. In familiar territory, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. "There's more," she continued. "In town tomorrow you'll see Sheriff Cole. Tell him I said roses bloom in thunder. He won't understand, but someone will. Can you remember that?" They nodded, eyes wide. Sarah gave them simple instructions for the next day, which routes to dig, what to say if questioned. She'd chosen these boys carefully over the years, testing their loyalty and discretion. Now that choice would pay off. After they left, Sarah went to the kitchen where Martha was cleaning up. The old housekeeper took one look at her face and nodded. "I'll pack some supplies and head to my sister's tomorrow." "No," Sarah said quietly. "I need you here. Some things are best witnessed by those who can be trusted to keep histories." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I was starting to think the Shadow Rose stories were just tales. But it was you all along, wasn't it? All these years." Sarah checked her Remingtons one last time before returning them to their hiding place. Tomorrow she'd wear them openly, but tonight they'd remain her secret. "Get some rest, Martha. When the Carson Gang arrives, they'll find exactly what they're looking for. A defenseless widow on an isolated ranch." She smiled, and for the first time in 8 years, it held the edge that had made hardened outlaws tremble. And then they'll find out why Shadow Rose was never just a story. The train whistle pierced the dawn silence, echoing across the Texas plains. Jack Carson watched from the ridge, his scarred face illuminated by the rising sun. Behind him, 11 men waited on horseback, faces masked, weapons ready. "Remember," he growled, checking his pocket watch, "quick and clean, no unnecessary killing." He touched the Queen of Hearts tucked in his hatband, his lucky charm since that day 8 years ago when Shadow Rose had nearly ended his career. Unless someone plays hero, the train rounded the bend right on schedule, steam billowing against the pink sky. Carson raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. His men moved like a well-oiled machine, years of experience evident in their precision. 2 riders matched the train's speed, leaping aboard with practiced ease. Gunshots rang out, warning shots into the air. Passengers screamed. The engineer, seeing armed men on the roof, began the emergency stop procedure exactly as expected. Carson watched with satisfaction as the train shuddered to a halt. This was his 23rd robbery, and he'd perfected the art. 3 minutes to secure the passengers, 2 minutes to locate the strongbox, 1 minute to clear out. But something felt wrong. The hairs on his neck stood up, a sensation he hadn't felt since that rainy night when Shadow Rose had him dead to rights. "Boss!" one of his men called from the train. "You need to see this." Inside the cargo car, Carson found what had spooked his man. The strongbox was there, but it was already open, empty, and on top lay a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, with a bullet hole dead center. "Search the whole train," he ordered, rage building. But he already knew they'd find nothing. This was a message, clear as day. Someone had known they were coming. A passenger, an elderly man who'd been unusually calm during the robbery, spoke up with a slight smile. "Heard there's a nice widow's ranch about 3 miles east. Might be a good place to rest." Carson's eyes narrowed. The message was too perfect, the setup too clean. Yet they needed a place to lay low. The army patrols would be all over this area within hours. "Mount up," he commanded. "We're paying a social call." As they rode east, Carson couldn't shake that familiar feeling of being watched. The same feeling he'd had years ago, tracking a murderer across New Mexico, only to find Shadow Rose had beaten him to the bounty. They crested a hill and saw the ranch spread out below, well-maintained, isolated, perfect for their needs. A single woman was visible on the porch, dressed in black, seemingly reading a book. "Widow's place, all right," his scout confirmed. "Locals say she's lived here 8 years, keeps to herself, runs the ranch clean, no trouble." 8 years. The number hit Carson like a physical blow. 8 years since Shadow Rose disappeared. 8 years since he'd been given a second chance at life and chosen to spite it. "Boss?" his lieutenant questioned. "What's the play?" Carson watched the widow turn a page in her book, the picture of serenity. If this was a trap, it was beautifully laid. If it wasn't, well, they needed a hideout. "We'll introduce ourselves proper-like," he decided. "Play it peaceful first. No need to spook her if she's just a widow." But as they rode down toward the ranch, Carson kept one hand near his gun. That prickling sensation on his neck hadn't gone away. If anything, it was getting stronger. The widow looked up as they approached, showing no sign of fear. Just calm, patient eyes that seemed to look right through him. Something about those eyes made Carson's blood run cold. He'd seen eyes like that before on a rainy night 8 years ago, right before everything changed. "Ma'am," he called out, tipping his hat, playing the role of a gentleman caller. "Might we trouble you for some water? Been a long ride?" The widow smiled, and for just a moment Carson could have sworn he saw thorns among the roses. Sarah marked her place in her book with deliberate slowness, every movement calculated. 8 years of preparation had taught her patience. Let them see a widow's gentle hands, not the calluses from 1,000 drawn guns. "Martha," she called softly, "would you bring water for our guests?" Her voice carried just the right touch of nervous hospitality. Carson dismounted first, his spurs jingling against her porch steps. She noted his limp was worse. The old injury had never healed right. Behind him, his men spread out in a practiced formation. Professionals, every one of them. This wasn't the same gang of frightened boys she'd encountered years ago. "Mighty kind of you, ma'am," Carson said, removing his hat. Trail dust coated his clothes, but his guns were clean. "Don't mean to impose, but we've had quite a journey." "No imposition at all," Sarah smiled, playing her role perfectly. "Though I'm afraid my ranch hands are away moving cattle, just myself and my housekeeper at present." She watched understanding flash in Carson's eyes. An isolated ranch, minimal witnesses. His men shifted subtly, hands moving closer to weapons. The game was beginning. Martha emerged with water, her hands trembling convincingly as she set down the tray. They'd rehearsed this moment countless times. "Will our guests be staying for supper, Mum?" Before Sarah could answer, Carson's lieutenant burst in from the barn. "Boss, found fresh tracks heading south. Whole herd moved out this morning. Place is clear." Carson's polite mask slipped slightly. "Well now, ma'am, seems we might need to impose on your hospitality a bit longer. Few days, maybe." Sarah allowed her hands to shake just slightly as she stood. I don't... Now don't fret." Carson stepped closer, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "We'll be perfect gentlemen, just need a quiet place to rest. You understand?" She backed away, letting fear show in her eyes. "The sheriff, he checks on me regular like—" "No, he don't." Carson's smile turned predatory. "Already checked your routine, ma'am. Nobody comes up here except Saturdays. Today being Tuesday, we've got plenty of time to get acquainted." Sarah clutched her book tighter, using it to hide the tension in her hands. Not fear. Anticipation. Through the window, she caught Martha's slight nod. Everything was in place. I suppose I have no choice," she whispered. "Smart lady," Carson gestured to his men. "Johnson, Watson, check the house. Rest of you secure the perimeter. The widow's going to show me around her lovely home." As his men moved out, Sarah noted each position, each sightline. They were good, professional, but they were playing her game now, walking into positions she'd planned for years. "Your library first, ma'am?" Carson suggested, clearly aware that studies often held valuables. "Seems like a learned woman such as yourself might have interesting Collections. Sarah led him toward her study, counting steps. 3 more paces, and he'd be standing exactly where she needed him. It's nothing special. Just a widow's dabbling. Carson paused at the threshold, that 6th sense of his triggering again. For a moment, his hand drifted toward his gun, but Sarah simply looked back at him with wide, frightened eyes, and his suspicion wavered. After all, what threat could a quiet widow pose to the notorious Carson Gang? Behind her mask of fear, Shadow Rose smiled. The trap was set. Now all she had to do was let them walk right into it. Darkness settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a silence that made Carson's men increasingly uneasy. Sarah moved through her kitchen with practiced domesticity, preparing dinner for her unwanted guests. Every movement was a calculated performance. "Smells mighty fine, ma'am," Carson said from his position by the door, where he'd been watching her for the past hour. "Been a while since we had home cooking." "My mother always said," Sarah responded softly, adding, "another pinch of herbs to the stew, that a proper hostess serves her guests well, willing or not." The herbs weren't just for flavor. They'd help make the men sleepy, less alert. Through the window, she watched his men patrolling her property. They'd established a solid security perimeter, but they were watching for threats coming in, not dangers already inside. "Johnson," Carson called to his lieutenant, "anything from the scout?" "No patrols within 10 miles, boss. Railroad bulls are all headed north, following that false trail we laid." Sarah noted the information while stirring her stew. 10 miles. No law enforcement. Exactly as she'd planned. Her message to the sheriff would have reached the right ears by now, but she'd made sure help wouldn't arrive too soon. "This was personal. Your men must be hungry," she said, her voice carefully modulated to show just the right amount of nervous concern. "Perhaps they could eat in shifts. I'm afraid my dining room only seats 6 comfortably." Carson studied her, that nagging suspicion flickering in his eyes again. "Mighty thoughtful, ma'am, but we'll eat in rotation, 4 at a time. Rest, keep watching." Perfect, exactly as she'd anticipated. Divide and separate. Martha helped her serve the meals, their movements synchronized from years of working together. The first group of outlaws ate eagerly, complimenting the cooking. They didn't notice how Sarah and Martha ate nothing, claiming they'd already dined. "Ma'am," one of the younger gang members said between mouthfuls, "you remind me of my mother. She was a widow too." "Shut up, Billy," Carson snapped. "No names." But Sarah had already catalogued it. Billy, young, sentimental, easily manipulated. Another piece in her puzzle. As night deepened, Carson assigned sleeping arrangements. 2 men. In the barn, 2 watching the road, others spread through the house. He took the guest room closest to Sarah's quarters, both to guard and intimidate her. "Hope you sleep well, Mr. Carson," she said meekly, pausing at her bedroom door, "though I expect a man in your profession rarely does." His head snapped up. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh," she feigned embarrassment, "just with all the traveling you must do. Must be hard to rest properly." He relaxed slightly, but she'd planted the seed. Let him wonder how much she knew, how much she guessed. In her room, Sarah moved silently to the window. The moon was rising, casting long shadows across her property. Perfect conditions. She'd spent years memorizing every creak in the floorboards, every shadow's pattern. A soft tap at her door, Martha's signal. 3 men already showing signs of drowsiness from her doctored stew. 2 more getting careless on patrol. Tired from the day's ride, Sarah changed into darker clothes, her movements silent from years of practice. Under her bed, hidden in a false compartment, lay a coil of thin wire, perfect for creating trip lines. She wouldn't move tonight, but preparation was everything. Through the wall, she heard Carson pacing. 7 steps, pause, 7 steps back, his injured leg dragging slightly. In the barn, horses shifted nervously. Animals always sensed trouble coming. A floorboard creaked downstairs. Sarah smiled. Right on schedule, the first man was heading to the outhouse, the herbs working their magic. Soon, they'd be rotating, through regularly, disrupting their own security patterns. She pulled out her old journal, adding notes by moonlight. Carson's men were professionals, but they had weaknesses. Billy's sentimentality, Johnson's obvious ambition. The way Watson favored his right side, telegraphing his drawers. A owl hooted outside, not a real owl, but a perfect imitation. Tom's signal. Her ranch hands had delivered her message and was safely away. Now the real game could begin. Sarah closed her journal and lay down fully clothed, alert despite her relaxed pose. Let them think she was a frightened widow trying to sleep. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late. In the darkness, Shadow Rose began her hunt. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Johnson made the first crucial mistake. Searching the study while Sarah supposedly slept, his lantern light caught something odd about the bookshelf. A leather-bound volume titled The Language of Flowers was slightly out of alignment with its neighbors. Pulling it revealed a hidden catch. Inside the hollow book, he found a single dried rose and a yellowed newspaper clipping. Shadow Rose claims. Another, notorious Bolton brothers brought to justice. The article described how the famous bounty hunter had tracked the brothers for 20 days, across 3 territories, finally cornering them in a church. They'd surrendered without a shot fired, claiming she'd haunted their every step, appearing and vanishing like a ghost. "Boss," Johnson whispered urgently, showing Carson his discovery. "Look at the date." Carson snatched the paper, his face paling. 8 years ago, just before Shadow Rose vanished, just before he'd had his own encounter with the legend. "There's more," Johnson continued. "Found these marks carved real subtle-like around the property. Thought they were just wear and tear, but—" He sketched in the dust a simple pattern that made Carson's blood run cold. Trail signs. Professional ones, the kind bounty hunters used to mark their territory. "Search everything," Carson ordered, his voice tight. "Now!" Sarah, listening from the shadowed hallway, allowed herself a small smile. The first seed of doubt was planted. Now to water it! She stepped into view, wrapped in her widow's shawl. "Is everything all right, Mr. Carson? I heard voices." Carson shoved the clipping into his pocket. "Just admiring your library, ma'am. You've got quite a collection." "Oh, yes." She moved to the shelves, pulling another book. "I find history fascinating, especially local stories." She opened to a marked page, like this one about Shadow Rose. "Have you heard of her?" Carson's hand twitched toward his gun. "Can't say that I have." "They say she was quite remarkable," Sarah continued innocently. "Could track a man for weeks without him ever knowing. Until one day she just vanished." She closed the book carefully. "Rather like a ghost." "Ghosts ain't real, ma'am," Carson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not." Sarah moved toward the kitchen. "Coffee, gentlemen? I'm afraid I'm an early riser. Old habits, you know." As she left, Carson grabbed Johnson's arm. "Check her background. Everything. How long she's been here, where she came from." "Already. A did, boss. Records show she bought this place 8 years ago. Widow of a rancher named Thomas Blackwood." Johnson hesitated. "But here's the thing. Can't find any record of Thomas Blackwood before that." Outside, the morning mist clung to the ground, thick enough to hide a person. Carson's men were growing jumpy, shooting glances at shadows. They'd grown up hearing Shadow Rose stories. Every mother's warning, every campfire tale about the bounty hunter who could appear from nowhere, strike without warning, and vanish like morning dew. Sarah served coffee on the porch, playing the perfect hostess. She'd positioned herself so the rising sun cast her shadow long across the boards, a rose-shaped brooch at her throat, creating an interesting pattern. Billy, the young outlaw, stared at the shadow too long. "Boss," he whispered, "about them stories. Shut up, Carson snapped, but his eyes never left Sarah. She'd let her movements change subtly, still gentle but more fluid. Let them see glimpses of the predator beneath the widow's weeds. Plant the questions in their minds. "Remarkable weather we're having," she commented. "Reminds me of a story I once heard, about a stormy night, a young outlaw, and a choice made. In mercy." Her eyes met Carson's. "Sometimes choices come back to haunt us, don't they?" Carson's coffee cup shattered on the porch boards. "My apologies," he said stiffly. "Clumsy of me." "No matter." Sarah bent to pick up the pieces, her movements economical, precise, nothing like a rancher's widow, everything like a hunter selecting her moment. "Johnson," Carson's voice was barely steady, "post more men on watch, and find out what happened to that sheriff who was supposed to check on her." "Already tried, boss. No one's seen him since yesterday, but I found this by the back gate." He held up a playing card, the Queen of Hearts, with a bullet hole dead center. Sarah hummed softly as she cleaned up the broken cup, an old bounty hunter's song about justice and judgment. Let them stew in their growing fear. Let them wonder. Shadow. Rose was done hiding. Now she was hunting. Midday heat shimmered across the ranch as Sarah made her first real move. She'd spent the morning watching Carson's men grow increasingly paranoid, jumping at shadows. Now it was time to push them harder. "Mr. Carson," she called from the kitchen, "would you help me with something in the cellar? These old stairs are so treacherous." Carson hesitated, suspicion warring with his need to maintain control. "Johnson, come with us." Perfect. 2 birds, 1 trap. The cellar stairs creaked ominously as they descended. Sarah held her lantern high, illuminating rows of preserved foods and aging wine. But Carson's eyes fixed on something else. The walls were lined with wanted posters. Dozens of them yellowed with age, each showing a captured outlaw. "My late husband's collection," Sarah explained innocently. He was fascinated by frontier justice. Johnson moved closer to one poster, then froze. It showed the Dawson brothers, noted as captured by Shadow Rose. In the corner, barely visible, was a familiar signature, the same rose pattern they'd found, carved around the property. "Found these hidden all over," Sarah continued, selecting a wine bottle. "Like little pieces of history. This ranch has such interesting stories, don't you think?" She turned, deliberately letting the lantern light catch her face from below. For just a moment she dropped the widow's mask, letting them see what she wanted them to see. Carson stumbled back, his hand going to his gun. "Everything all right, Mr. Carson? You look like you've seen a ghost." Above them a floorboard creaked. Someone moving in the house. Carson's head snapped up, distracted. When he looked back, Sarah was just a widow again, holding a wine bottle and wearing a concerned expression. But the damage was done. She'd seen his fear. Throughout the afternoon, she implemented her strategy. A wanted poster would appear where there hadn't been one before. Tools in the barn would be rearranged in the pattern of a rose. Voices would whisper just at the edge of hearing. "Boss," Billy reported nervously, "found these in the stable." He held out a pair of custom-made spurs, decorated with rose engravings. "They weren't there this morning, I swear it." Carson's men were unraveling. They doubled the watch, but every guard reported strange movements, shadows that didn't behave quite right. The ranch seemed to have come alive around them. Martha played her part perfectly, accidentally dropping hints as she worked. "Miss Sarah's so good with patterns," she commented while serving dinner. "Always knows how to make things line up just right. Like tracking," she says. "Everything leaves a trail if you know how to read it." Sarah watched Carson's men eat, noting how they clustered together now. No more separate shifts. Safety in numbers. But that just made her job easier, containing them exactly where she wanted them. As night approached, she made her boldest move yet. In Carson's room, while Martha distracted him, she left a single sheet of paper on his pillow. On it, in precise Handwriting was a list of names, his victims. At the bottom, a simple message. Justice comes for everyone, Jack. Even 8 years later, the explosion when he found it was exactly what she'd expected. Carson burst from his room, gun drawn, face white with rage and fear. "Search everything," he roared. "Every corner, every shadow, find her!" "Find who, boss?" Johnson asked, but his voice shook. "You know damn well who. She's here. She's been here all along." Sarah stood in her doorway, the picture of confused innocence. "Mr. Carson, is something wrong?" He rounded on her, gun pointed at her heart. For a long moment their eyes met. She let him see it then. The steel behind the softness. The hunter, behind the widow's veil. "Boss," Johnson whispered urgently, "we've got riders coming, lot of them." Carson lowered his gun slowly, visibly forcing himself to stay calm. "How many?" "Can't tell in this light. Dust says at least a dozen." Sarah smiled softly. "Probably just my ranch hands returning early. Unless... Were you expecting company, Mr. Carson?" The trap was closing. Her prey was exactly where she wanted. Them armed, dangerous, and terrified of shadows. Now the real hunt could begin. The approaching riders vanished like a mirage. Nothing but wind-blown dust and paranoia playing tricks in the darkness. But the damage was done. Carson's men huddled in the main room of the ranch house, jumping at every creak and shadow. Their professional demeanor had cracked, revealing the frightened men beneath. "Ain't natural," Billy whispered, his young face pale in the lamplight. "Things moving that weren't there before, sounds that don't make sense." "Shut up," Carson snapped, but his authority was slipping. His men had seen the fear in his eyes when he'd found that list of names. They'd watched him pull his gun on an unarmed widow. Now they were asking themselves questions he couldn't answer. Sarah moved among them like a ghost, serving coffee with trembling hands that somehow never spilled a drop. Her every movement was a calculated performance, designed to draw their eyes and make them miss what was really happening around them. "More sugar, Mr. Johnson?" she asked softly, standing too close behind him. He jumped, coffee splashing across the table. "Don't do that," he snarled, then caught himself. "I mean, no thank you, Mom." But she'd seen his hand shake, noticed how his eyes darted to the shadows behind her. Another crack in their facade, another pressure point exposed. Carson watched her with growing certainty. The way she moved, the subtle confidence beneath her fearful exterior. It was all familiar. 8 years ago, on that stormy night, he'd seen those same calculating eyes behind a gun barrel. He'd been young then, scared. She'd let him live, thinking he might change. "Miss Sarah," he said carefully, testing his theory, "you never did tell us how your husband died." She paused by the fireplace, the flames casting her shadow on the wall. For a moment it looked like her shadow was wearing a gun belt. "Died in a storm," she said softly. 8 years ago. Bad night for everyone, wasn't it, Mr. Carson?" The room went silent. His men looked between them, sensing the undercurrent, but "Not understanding it, boss?" Johnson questioned. "What's she talking about?" Before Carson could respond, a shot rang out in the darkness. One of his men burst through the door, clutching his arm. "Someone's out there, moving through the shadows, fast as a ghost. Watson, Peters, check the perimeter," Carson ordered. "Johnson, with me. Rest of you, watch her." But Sarah had already slipped away in the confusion, leaving only an empty coffee cup and a playing card on the table. The Queen of Hearts, naturally. Outside, Carson and his men found nothing but shadows and wind. But someone had disarmed all their carefully placed warnings, disabled their escape routes. Horses they'd tied securely were now loose, saddles missing. "It's her," Carson muttered, his composure cracking. "It's been her all along," Shadow rose. "Playing with us like mice." "That widow?" Watson scoffed, but his voice shook. "Boss, you're letting ghost stories spook you." "Ghost stories?" Carson rounded on him. "I've seen her work. Watched her break men harder than you without firing a shot. She gets in their heads, makes them see things, doubt everything. By the time she shows herself, they're begging to be arrested. A laugh echoed through the darkness, soft, feminine, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Carson's men huddled closer, guns drawn. Inside, Billy was the first to break. "I ain't staying here," he announced, heading for the door. "Ghost or bounty hunter, don't matter, I'm out. Take one more step," Carson's voice cracked like a whip, "and I'll kill you myself." But the damage was spreading. His men looked at each other with growing suspicion. Who would run next? Who might make a deal with the hunter to save themselves? Sarah watched from the shadows as her carefully laid psychological traps did their work. Carson's gang was fracturing exactly as planned. Now to apply more pressure. Martha's scream pierced the night, perfectly timed, perfectly pitched. The men rushed to the kitchen to find only an open door swinging in the wind, and on the table, a bounty hunter's ledger, open to a page with their names, amounts listed beside each one. "Found this in the barn," Johnson reported, holding up a worn duster coat. "Hidden under some hay. Got rose patterns worked into the leather." Carson snatched it, recognizing the workmanship, the same coat she'd worn that night in the storm, when she'd had him dead to rights. "Search the house," he ordered. "Every room, every corner. Find her." But Sarah was already 3 moves ahead. As they rushed upstairs, she slipped through her hidden passages, channels built into the walls during 8 years of patient preparation. She'd designed this house to be her weapon, every room a potential trap. Through gaps in the walls, she watched them discover her caches, one after another, each revealing another piece of her identity. Gun oil and cleaning rags in the pantry, wanted posters hidden behind paintings, a collection of sheriff's badges, from 3 territories, each marked with the date and location of a capture. "She's been planning this," Carson realized, his voice hoarse. 8 years, setting this all up, waiting. "For what?" Johnson demanded. Sarah's voice drifted through the house, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Justice, Jack. I gave you a chance once. You chose your path." The gang clustered together in the main room, backs to the walls, watching every shadow. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant thunder. Just like that night 8 years ago, Carson's composure finally shattered. "Shadow Rose," he shouted into the darkness. "Show yourself. Face me." Sarah's soft laugh was his only answer, followed by the distinct sound of a gun being cocked, first from one direction, then another, then seemingly everywhere at once. 8 years ago, her voice came again, closer now, "I showed mercy to a frightened boy. Tonight I hunt a murderer. The question is, Jack, how many of your men will die trying to protect you?" The gang members looked at each other, then at their leader. Fear and suspicion had done their work. The mighty Carson Gang was unraveling, and the hunt had only just begun. Thunder rolled across the Texas plain as Sarah made her next move. She'd changed now, the widow's black dress replaced with the worn leather duster they'd found in the barn. In her study, she strapped on her twin Remingtons, old friends awakening. After 8 years of silence, through the walls, she heard Carson's men arguing. Their fear had turned to anger, then to blame, exactly as planned. "You knew," Johnson was shouting, "knew we were walking into Shadow Rose's trap and didn't tell us." "She's one woman," Carson shot back, but his voice cracked. "One bounty hunter, who got lucky years ago." "Lucky?" Billy's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Boss, my pa told me stories about her. Said she tracked the McClintock gang for 30 days straight. Never slept, never stopped. By the end, they were so spooked they shot at their own shadows. Found them tied up in the middle of town, babbling about a ghost with rose-handled guns." Sarah smiled, remembering. The McClintocks had been tough ones, but everyone broke eventually when the hunter became the hunted. She moved silently through her hidden passages, positioning herself. Martha's voice drifted up from below. The old woman telling stories to the increasingly unnerved gang members. "Oh yes," Martha was saying, her voice carrying clearly. "She's brought in some terrible men. They say the worst ones. She hunts slow. follows them for weeks, leaving little signs, rose petals in their coffee, their own wanted posters appearing in empty rooms, their victims' names written in the dust. Lightning flashed, illuminating Sarah through a window just long enough to be seen. The gang members fired wildly, bullets splintering wood where she'd stood, but she was already gone, leaving only the echo of soft laughter. "She's toying with us," Watson snarled, "playing her games instead of facing us straight, like you faced those children on the train." Sarah's voice came from the darkness. 6 years old, Watson. Brother and sister. Their mother still puts flowers on their graves. Watson paled. How did you know?" "I know everything about you. All of you. Every robbery, every murder, every innocent life taken for greed. I've had 8 years to study your crimes, to plan your punishment." Her voice seemed to move as she spoke, coming from different directions. The gang members spun uselessly, trying to track her. "Remember the Sanderson job, Peters? 3 dead guards. Or the Miller Ranch, Johnson? Poor old man never even reached for a weapon. And Billy," her voice softened, "2 months with the gang and already blood on your hands. Your mother would weep to see you now." Billy broke first, making a run for the door. Carson's gun cracked once, but the bullet hit wood. The young outlaw disappeared into the storm. "How many more, Jack?" Sarah called. "How many more men will you sacrifice?" "She's inside the walls," Johnson realized suddenly. "The whole house. She built it as a trap." Carson's composure finally shattered. "Burn it!" he screamed. "Burn it all down!" But as his men reached for their matches, Sarah made her presence known. Gunshots rang out with surgical precision, not hitting the men, but striking their hands, sending matches and weapons flying. 8 years ago. Her voice was closer now, almost intimate. "I let a young outlaw live, thinking he might change. Instead, he became a killer of children. Tonight, I correct that mistake." Lightning flashed again, and this time she let them see her fully. Standing at the top of the stairs, Shadow Rose had returned. The legend made flesh. Her duster moved. In the wind from the broken windows, the rose-handled Remingtons gleaming at her sides. "Mother of God," Watson breathed. The stories were true. "Last chance," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the weight of judgment. "Surrender now, walk out alive, resist." She smiled, and it was the smile that had haunted campfire stories for a decade. "And learn why they called me the ghost that never sleeps." Johnson moved first, drawing with the speed that had made him famous in 3 territories. Sarah's gun seemed to materialize in her hand, slots faster. His weapon went spinning, along with 3 of his fingers. The others backed away, looking to Carson for guidance, but their leader stood frozen, seeing not the woman before him, but the memory of that rainy night 8 years ago. The night mercy had been offered and spurned. "You can't take all of us," he managed finally. Sarah's laugh was cold as winter steel. "I already have. Billy's running straight to the sheriff's posse, the one that's been watching the ranch for hours. Watson's bleeding out from the graze I gave him earlier. Slow, but he'll drop soon. Johnson can't shoot with his right hand ruined. And Peters—" She paused. "Peters has already made his choice. Haven't you?" All eyes turned to Peters, who stood pale and shaking, his gun pointed at Carson's back. She found me an hour ago," he whispered. "Showed me the evidence about what really happened to my brother last year. How you set him up to take the fall." The storm raged outside, but in the ranch house time seemed to stand still. Shadow. Rose stood at the top of the stairs, her legend now fully restored. Below, the mighty Carson Gang was coming apart at the seams, destroyed not by force, but by their own fears and guilt. "The ghost that hunts other ghosts," Billy had called her once. Looking at her now, backlit by lightning, her guns reflecting the storm's fury, they finally understood. Shadow Rose wasn't just a bounty hunter, she was vengeance itself. Patient, as winter, inevitable as dawn, and her hunt was nearly complete. Lightning illuminated the ranch house in stark bursts as Sarah descended the stairs, each step deliberate and measured. Her eyes never left Carson, but her words were for the others. "You boys ever wonder why your jobs got so bloody these past few years?" Her voice carried easily over the storm. "Why Carson suddenly started killing witnesses when he never did before?" Carson's face twisted. "Shut up! Tell them, Jack. Tell them about your other employer, the one who's been giving you targets, turning train robberies into assassinations." Johnson's head snapped up, his wounded hand forgotten. "Boss, what's she talking about?" Sarah smiled coldly. "The Carson Gang isn't just robbing trains. They're eliminating rivals for someone much bigger, a legitimate businessman named James Thaddeus Montgomery." The name fell like a thunderbolt in the room. Montgomery was railroad royalty, a man whose empire stretched across 3 territories. His reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, but no one had ever proven anything against him. 8 years ago, Sarah continued, descending another step, I wasn't just hunting Jack Carson. I was closing in on Montgomery, had evidence of everything, the murders, the land grabs, the corrupt judges. But then, her eyes locked on Carson. Someone burned down the Marshals' office in Twin Rivers. All the evidence gone. 3 lawmen dead. Understanding dawned in Johnson's eyes. "That job, you said it was just papers we were after." Montgomery took a scared young outlaw and turned him into a killer. Sarah's voice was ice. "Gave him a taste of real power. And Carson's been his personal assassin ever since, targeting anyone who might threaten Montgomery's empire." Carson laughed suddenly, a harsh sound. "Proof, then? You've got all this evidence, all these claims, 8 years of planning. Show us." Sarah reached into a duster, withdrawing not a weapon but a letter. "Your last orders in Montgomery's own hand. The train robbery was cover. Your real target was U.S. Marshal Daniel Hayes, Montgomery's own brother-in-law, who'd finally grown a conscience." She tossed the letter to Johnson, who read it with widening eyes. "These names, these are all our recent jobs. Everyone we've killed. All Montgomery's enemies," Sarah confirmed. "And now you boys are his loose ends. Think about it, a notorious gang hiding at an isolated ranch. Perfect place for a tragic fire that leaves no survivors." As if on cue, they heard horses approaching. Many horses. That's not the sheriff's. "A posse," Sarah said quietly. "Montgomery's men coming to clean house. He never intended to let any of you live." Carson's composure cracked completely. "You're lying." "Am I? Check your coat pocket, Jack. The one you haven't used since you got here." With trembling hands, Carson reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded paper he hadn't put there. Another letter in Montgomery's hand, detailing the gang's elimination once the job was done. 8 years, Sarah's voice carried satisfaction. "Not just planning revenge on you, Jack. Building a case against the real monster. Every robbery, every murder, all leading back to Montgomery. And now I have his trusted killer and entire gang ready to testify." The approaching riders were closer. Now, Montgomery's death squad coming to tie up loose ends. But they'd find something very different waiting for them. "So," Sarah drew her Remingtons with fluid grace, "what's it going to be, boys? Die for the man who betrayed you, or help me bring down the biggest killer in Texas?" The storm raged outside. As the Carson Gang faced their moment of truth, realizing they'd been pawns in a game far bigger than they'd imagined, and Sarah Blackwood, the legendary Shadow Rose, had played them all perfectly. The thunder seemed to hold its breath as Carson's men processed their betrayal. Johnson was the first to move, turning his gun to cover Carson instead of Sarah. "All those extra killings," he said, voice shaking with rage. "Those weren't your calls at all, were they? Every time you said no witnesses, those were Montgomery's orders." Carson backed away, finding himself surrounded by his own men. Only Watson still stood by his side, and even he looked uncertain. "You don't understand," Carson pleaded. Montgomery's power, what he can do, I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Sarah's voice cut through his excuses. 8 years ago, I offered you one. Tonight, I'm offering another. But this time, it's helped me take down Montgomery, or go down with him. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Martha appeared from the kitchen, carrying not food, but ammunition. Miss Sarah, they're coming up the North Road. 12 riders, heavily armed. Sarah nodded. Now came the real test of her plan. Montgomery's men will burn this place to the ground, kill everyone inside, make it look like a gang hideout, discovered and eliminated. Very neat, very clean. How long have you been planning this? Peters asked, still covering Carson with his gun. 8 years of gathering evidence, tracking money, following leads. All I needed was Carson's gang in the right place at the right time, with the right motivation to turn on their master. More thunder, closer now. The storm and Montgomery's killers approaching together. I've got evidence cached throughout the territory, Sarah continued. Enough to hang Montgomery 10 times over, but a gang of outlaws turning state's evidence against him. That's what will make it stick. Johnson laughed bitterly. So we were bait, just like we were bait for Montgomery. Difference is, Sarah smiled, coldly, I'm offering you a chance to live, to make something right. Carson suddenly straightened, a new calculation in his eyes. You need us alive, need our testimony. That's why you haven't killed any of us, despite having plenty of chances. True, Sarah admitted. But I only need some of you alive. Your choice how many survive the night. The approaching hooves were thunder on the ground now. Time had run out. I'm in, Johnson declared, stepping to Sarah's side. Rather hang Montgomery than die for him. Peters and 2 others followed. Billy, who'd run earlier, would be safe with the sheriff. That left Carson and Watson backed against the wall. Jack, Sarah's voice softened slightly. 8 years ago, I saw something in you worth saving. That's why I let you live. Tonight's your last chance to prove I wasn't wrong. A tremendous crash of thunder split the night. In that moment, Carson seemed to age years. The ruthless gang leader fell away, revealing the scared young man she'd spared that rainy night. Montgomery will kill everyone I ever knew, he whispered. Not if we kill him first, Sarah promised. Watson looked between them, then slowly lowered his gun. Rather die fighting Montgomery than die for him. Carson stood alone now, the last piece in Sarah's elaborate game. Through the windows, they could see torches approaching, Montgomery's death squad coming to tie up loose ends. Time to choose, Jack, Sarah said softly. Die for the man who betrayed you, or help me deliver justice to the real monster. Carson met her eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, she saw something there besides fear or cruelty. She saw hope. Tell me what you need, he said. Sarah's smile was fierce as she tossed him a loaded rifle. Welcome to the hunt, boys. This time, we're hunting the biggest wolf in Texas. Outside, Montgomery's killers approached the ranch, expecting to find easy prey. Instead, they were riding into a trap laid by the legendary Shadow Rose, with the most notorious gang in Texas now on her side. The real hunt was about to begin. Sarah moved through the ranch house with lethal efficiency, positioning her newfound allies with the same precision she'd once used to hunt them. 8 years of planning had built this house into a fortress, and now she would show them exactly how. Johnson, Peters, take the high windows. Those shutters are reinforced, perfect for cover. She tossed them each a box of ammunition from Martha's seemingly endless supply. Carson, with me. You know how Montgomery's men operate. Carson nodded, his earlier fear replaced by cold determination. They'll have Spencer rifles, like to hit, hard and fast, overwhelm with superior firepower. Good thing this old widow's been collecting guns for 8 years then. Sarah smiled grimly, sliding back a false panel to reveal an arsenal that made the outlaws whistle in appreciation. Custom weapons, all of them. No serial numbers. You really did plan for everything, Watson said, checking the action on a pristine Henry rifle. 8 years is a long time to prepare. Sarah moved to the window, studying the approaching torches through the rain. They'll split into 3 groups. Standard Montgomery tactics. 2 to pin us down, 1 to come in through the back. How do you know his tactics so well? Johnson asked, settling into his firing position. Sarah's eyes were cold in the lamplight. Because I've been hunting his operations for 8 years. Every accident that killed a rival, every random attack that removed an opponent. I was there, watching, learning, building my case. Tonight's just the final piece. Martha appeared with more ammunition and, surprisingly, coffee. They'll be expecting frightened outlaws hiding in a ranch house, the old woman said calmly. Not Shadow Rose and her hunters. Speaking of which, Sarah opened another hidden compartment, revealing a stack of dark dusters similar to her own. Put these on. Montgomery's men are looking for the Carson Gang. Let's show them something else entirely. As the men donned the coats, their transformation was remarkable. No longer a scattered gang of outlaws, but a coordinated unit of hunters. Sarah's hunters. Carson, she called softly, you know what wearing that coat means? No going back. No deals with Montgomery. You're choosing a side. He fingered the rose embroidered on the collar, remembering that night 8 years ago when she'd offered him his first chance at redemption. I chose wrong once. Not again. Thunder crashed overhead as Sarah laid out her plan. Every approach to the house was covered, every line of fire calculated. She'd spent 8 years preparing this battlefield, and Montgomery's men were about to learn why Shadow Rose was more than just a legend. They'll expect us to be watching the front, she explained, pointing out positions on a detailed map of the property. Standard procedure would be to concentrate our defense there. Instead, she smiled coldly, we're going to let them think they've outflanked us. The back entrance, Carson realized, it's a trap. The whole house is a trap. Every window, every door. But they need to believe they're in control, need to think their plan is working. Johnson, who'd made his reputation planning robberies, studied her preparations with growing admiration. You're not just setting up an ambush. You're creating a story they'll believe, making them think they're the hunters. Until they realize. They're the prey, Sarah finished. Montgomery's always been the spider in the center of the web, controlling everything from a safe distance. Tonight, we're going to give him a message he can't ignore. She checked her Remingtons one final time, the rose engravings catching the lamplight. Remember, they'll be shooting to kill. We need some alive to testify, but self-defense is a powerful legal argument. The thunder was directly overhead now, and with it came the sound of horses being reined in. Montgomery's killers were taking their positions, no doubt congratulating themselves on catching the Carson Gang unaware. One last thing, Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the house. After tonight, there's no going back to who you were. You're either Shadow Rose's hunters or you're dead. Choose now. The answer came in the sound of weapons being checked, positions being taken. These men, who hours ago had been her enemies, now waited for her orders with the discipline of a military unit. Martha brought out one final item, a black hat with a single rose carved into the band. Sarah's old hunting hat, not worn in 8 years. Time to remind them why they used to fear the dark, Sarah said softly, placing the hat on her head. Let's give Montgomery's boys a proper Shadow Rose welcome. The storm reached its peak as Montgomery's men took their positions around the ranch house. Through the rain-streaked windows, Sarah counted 12 shadows, moving with military precision. Their leader, a tall man with a silver scar across his cheek, used hand signals to direct his teams. That's Cole Hawkins, Carson whispered from his position beside her, Montgomery's personal executioner. If he's here, this isn't just a cleanup. Montgomery wants to make sure it's done right. Sarah's smile was cold in the darkness. Good. When Hawkins doesn't return, Montgomery will know exactly who sent the message. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark flashes, revealing the killer's positions. They were good, professionals all. Their approach was textbook perfect if they'd been dealing with ordinary outlaws. "They're moving into the kill zones," Johnson reported quietly from his window. "Just like you said they would." Sarah had positioned her newly minted hunters carefully. Each man had multiple covered positions to move between, creating the illusion of greater numbers. More importantly, each position was carefully planned to support the others. "Remember," she said softly, her voice carrying to every corner of the house, "let them think they're in control. Let them believe their plan is working." Martha appeared one last time, moving silently between positions with extra ammunition. The old woman showed no fear, only grim determination. She'd been part of this plan for 8 years, after all. "Riders. Coming in from the north," Peters called from his post. 3 more men, expensive horses, fancy gear." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she studied the newcomers through her rain-streaked window. "Montgomery sent observers. He wants to make sure it's done right, and that his own men don't survive to talk." "Boss." Miss Sarah," Watson corrected himself. "We got movement at the back door. They're starting." A flash of lightning revealed Hawkins directing his men into their final positions. In minutes, they would launch their assault, expecting to find a terrified gang hiding in the dark. "Carson," Sarah called softly. "Last chance to back out. Once this starts—" He checked his rifle, face set with determination. "8 years ago, you offered me a choice. I chose wrong. Tonight I choose justice." The other men nodded in agreement. They'd been ruthless outlaws hours ago, but something had changed. Perhaps it was the betrayal by Montgomery, or maybe it was simply the power of Shadow Rose's legend. Either way, they were hunters now. Thunder crashed overhead as Sarah made her final checks. Every angle was covered, every escape route trapped. She'd spent 8 years preparing this house for tonight, turning it into a weapon as deadly as her twin Remingtons. "Miss Sarah," Martha's voice came quietly from the kitchen. "They're cutting the telegraph lines." The battle erupted like the storm itself, lightning fast and thunderous. Hawkins gave his signal, and Montgomery's killers struck from 3 directions at once, their coordinated attack a testament to their professional training. The front door exploded inward under concentrated rifle fire. Windows shattered as grappling hooks sailed through them. Men in black dusters burst in, weapons ready, moving with practiced precision. They found empty rooms. "Something's wrong," Hawkins barked, his instincts screaming. "This is too—" Sarah's voice cut through the darkness, calm as winter steel. "Now!" The trap sprang with devastating efficiency. Hidden panels in the walls slid open, revealing Sarah's hunters in prepared firing positions. The ranch house Sarah had spent 8 years modifying became a killing ground. Johnson and Peters opened fire from above, their elevated positions giving them perfect angles on the men who'd breached the front. Carson and Watson struck from concealed alcoves, catching the flanking team in a deadly crossfire. But it was Sarah who proved why she was legendary. She seemed to materialize from nowhere, her twin Remingtons dancing in the lightning flashes. 2 of Montgomery's men went down before they could turn, leg wounds dropping them screaming. A third lost his weapon to a precision shot that shattered his gun hand. "Ghost!" one of them screamed. "It's Shadow!" "Ah!" His warning cut off as Sarah's. Boot connected with his jaw, her movement a fluid combination of grace and violence. She flowed through Montgomery's men like smoke, each strike precise, each shot carefully placed to wound rather than kill. "Need them alive," she called to her hunters. "Dead men can't testify." Hawkins proved his reputation, rallying his remaining men with professional skill. "Fall back! Defensive positions!" But Sarah had planned for this too. As Montgomery's killers retreated toward their prepared positions outside, they found their routes blocked. During the earlier confusion, Martha had quietly moved through the storm, removing the ladder they'd used to scale the back wall, triggering deadfalls that blocked crucial escape paths. "The horses!" Hawkins commanded. "Get to the—" A shot rang. Out from the barn, Billy's voice crying, clear, telling Sarah the young outlaw had returned with perfect timing to secure their mounts. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the battlefield. Montgomery's professional killers found themselves caught in the open, surrounded by hunters wearing black dusters and rose-marked hats. The predators had become prey. 8 years, Sarah's voice carried across the yard. 8 years I spent preparing for tonight, every angle calculated, every escape route mapped. You're not just facing the Carson Gang boys, you're facing Shadow Rose and her hunters. Hawkins, proving his worth, snapped off a shot that would have killed a normal opponent. But Sarah was already moving, her return fire sending his weapons spinning away along with 2 of his fingers. "That's for the Miller family," she said coldly. "The ones you killed on Montgomery's orders last spring. The remaining killers tried to rally, but they were professionals facing something beyond their experience. Every move they made was anticipated. Every tactic countered before they could execute it." Carson proved his change of allegiance, moving with deadly efficiency to cut off their attempted flanking maneuver. "Southeast corner," he called out, and Sarah's hunters shifted smoothly to trap another group of Montgomery's men. "Boss!" one of Montgomery's observers shouted from their position on the ridge. "We need to—" Sarah's shot knocked him from his horse, a clean wound through his shoulder. His companions wheeled their mounts to flee, but found themselves facing Peters and Johnson, who'd used Sarah's hidden paths to circle behind them. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. Montgomery's elite kill team lay groaning in the mud, each man wounded with surgical precision, none dead, but none capable of fighting. Just as Sarah had planned, she walked among them now, her black duster flowing in the storm wind, every inch the legend they'd feared. "Your wounds will heal," she announced, "just in time for you to testify about Montgomery's operation, about every murder, every accident, every rival that needed to disappear." Hawkins, clutching his ruined hand, glared up at her. "Montgomery will kill us all." Sarah's smile was colder than the rain. "Montgomery won't survive the week. You're just the first piece to fall. By dawn, every marshal and newspaper in 3 territories will have proof of his crimes. But your testimony, that's what will hang him." She turned to her hunters, the transformed Carson Gang who'd helped bring down Montgomery's killers. "Secure them, tend their wounds. When the marshal arrives, we want them healthy enough to talk." The storm was passing now, the thunder moving east. But for Montgomery's men, the real nightmare was just beginning. They'd come to eliminate witnesses, only to become witnesses themselves. And Shadow Rose's hunt was far from over. Dawn was breaking over the ranch when the sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention. Not the sheriff's posse. These horses moved with military precision, and at their head rode a figure Sarah had waited 8 years to meet. "Montgomery," Carson breathed, recognizing the railroad baron's distinctive white horse. Sarah smiled coldly. "Right on time. A man like that can't stand not knowing what happened to his kill team." She turned to her hunters. "Places, boys. One last act to perform." James Thaddeus Montgomery cut an impressive figure as he rode into the ranch yard, flanked by 6 private guards. His expensive suit and silver-handled pistol spoke of wealth, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a killer. "My God," he said, surveying his wounded men. "The stories were true. Shadow Rose lives." Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her black duster catching the morning light. 8 years, Mr. Montgomery. I've spent 8 years preparing for this morning. My dear lady," Montgomery's smile was practiced, politician smooth. "I'm afraid I don't—" "Save it," Sarah cut him off. "Your men are already talking about the murders, the staged accidents, every rival and witness you've had eliminated. By noon, every marshal and newspaper in 3 territories will have proof of your operations." Montgomery's smile didn't waver, but his guards' hands moved toward their weapons. "Proof? The ravings of captured criminals? My dear, I'm a respected businessman. Who would believe? They'll believe this." Carson stepped forward, throwing down a stack of papers. "Every order you gave me, every target, every murder, all in your handwriting with your personal seal." Now, Montgomery's smile slipped. "Carson, you disappoint me. After all I've done for you, you made me a killer." Carson's voice cracked. "She offered me redemption." Montgomery's composure finally broke. "Kill them all," he screamed to his guards. "Burn everything." But Sarah had been ready for this too. As Montgomery's men drew their weapons, her hunters emerged from their positions. The guards found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and facing the wrong end of a legend. "Drop them," Sarah's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Or join Hawkins in testifying." 5 guards immediately lowered their weapons, hardened men who knew when a fight was lost. The 6th, younger and more foolish, tried to be a hero. Sarah's Remington cracked once. The young guard's gun went spinning along with his dreams of glory. Montgomery, seeing his last defense crumble, went for his silver-handled pistol. Sarah's second shot knocked it from his hand before his fingers could close on the grip. "That was for Twin Rivers," she said coldly. "The lawmen you had murdered, the evidence you burned, the lives you've destroyed playing king." "You can't touch me," Montgomery snarled, but fear had replaced the calculation in his eyes. "I own judges, politicians, not anymore." Sarah nodded to Martha, who emerged with a final stack of papers. 8 years of investigating. Every bribe, every corrupt official, every crime documented. And now, thanks to your kill team's testimony, we can prove it all. The sound of multiple horses approaching drew everyone's attention. This time it was the law. Marshals from 3 territories, accompanied by newspaper men and witnesses Sarah had carefully cultivated over 8 years. "It's over, Montgomery," she said quietly. "Your empire falls today." The railroad baron's face twisted with rage. With surprising speed, he drew a hidden derringer. "I won't hang!" he screamed. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous. Before Montgomery could aim, her Remington barked one last time. The derringer went flying, along with several of Montgomery's fingers. 8 years ago," she said, walking to where he clutched his bleeding hand, "I let mercy guide my hand with Carson. Today, justice guides it with you. You'll face every charge, answer for every crime. The legend of Shadow Rose ends with your empire's fall." As the marshals took Montgomery into custody, Sarah turned to her hunters, former outlaws transformed into instruments of justice. "Your testimony puts him away. Forever. After that, you've got a choice. Return to your old lives, or keep wearing those dusters." Carson looked at the rose emblem on his collar, then at the rising sun. 8 years ago, you saw something in me worth saving. Maybe it's time we helped you save others." Sarah smiled, and for the first time in 8 years, it held warmth instead of winter. The legend of Shadow Rose might be ending, but something new was beginning. Justice had a new face in the territories, and it wore a black duster with a rose. A month after Montgomery's arrest, Sarah stood on her porch, watching the sunset. The ranch had been repaired, bullet holes patched, broken windows replaced, but she'd kept the hidden passages and reinforced walls. Some preparations were worth maintaining. The sound of horses announced her hunter's return. Carson led the group, 5 riders in black dusters carrying a bound prisoner. Their first independent mission had been successful. "The Hamilton gang won't be troubling any more homesteaders," Carson reported, dismounting. "Found evidence linking them to 3 other crimes, too." Sarah nodded approvingly. The former outlaws had taken to justice work with surprising dedication. Perhaps they, like her, had found purpose in protecting the innocent rather than preying on them. "Any problems?" she asked, noting their pristine condition. "Didn't even have to fire a shot." Johnson grinned. "Just showed them the rose emblems. On our dusters. Amazing how quick outlaws surrender when they think Shadow Rose is hunting them." The legend had grown, transformed. Shadow Rose was no longer just one hunter, but a symbol. Her hunters had become known throughout the territories. Former outlaws turned protectors, each wearing the rose emblem that struck fear into criminals' hearts. Martha emerged with coffee. Her role evolved from housekeeper to coordinator of their expanding operation. "Letter came from the governor," she announced. "Montgomery's trial starts next week. Between the evidence and testimony, they're expecting a hanging." Sarah touched the rose-handled Remington at her hip. 8 years of patience, planning and preparation had brought justice at last. But more importantly, it had created something lasting. "Miss Sarah," Billy called from the barn, where he was teaching new recruits the art of tracking. 3 more. Former outlaws had sought them out, asking for the same chance at redemption Carson had received. "The legacy grows," she said softly, watching her unlikely family of hunters prepare for another night of protecting the territories. Carson joined her on the porch, his own transformation from ruthless gang leader to respected hunter now complete. "8 years ago you offered me a choice. Now we're offering that same choice to others." Sarah smiled, remembering that rainy night when mercy had seemed like weakness. Instead, it had been the seed of something powerful. Shadow Rose had become more than a legend. It had become a symbol of redemption, of justice tempered with mercy. "The territories are changing," she observed. "They need more than just bounty hunters. They need protectors." As night fell over the ranch, Sarah Blackwood watched her hunters gather around the fire. Former outlaws transformed into guardians, each wearing the rose emblem that had once struck fear, now brought hope. The legend of Shadow Rose hadn't ended with Montgomery's fall. It had evolved, grown stronger. In the dark corners of the territories, criminals now whispered new stories of black-clad hunters who offered a choice: redemption or justice. And in a ranch house built for war but transformed by peace, a widow, who was never just a widow, kept watch, her twin Remingtons ready, her hunters prepared, and her legacy secured.